Welcome to the second lecture of American Government 2. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Baggs, and our topic this week is Congress. The framers expected that Congress, not the President or the judiciary, would be the most important branch of the government. This is why they defined it in the first article of the Constitution. They knew that laws would matter greatly to the young nation's survival, and they designed a lawmaking structure based on clear rules and powers. The framers made their most important decision about Congress late in the Constitutional Convention when they created a two-house legislature. This is known as bicameralism. Small states were guaranteed the same number of senators as larger states, while the large states were guaranteed more representatives than the smaller states. Each chamber has different wings of the Capitol building, different offices, different committee structures, different rules for considering legislation, and different rules for governing its own members. Every Congress operates for 2 years, and they are numbered going back to the first Congress in 1789. The Congress that was sworn in on January 3rd, 2025 will be the 119th Congress. Enumerated powers. All congressional powers trace back to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution and its list of enumerated powers. Enumerated powers are specifically listed or written in the Constitution, and Congress was given the following powers. Because the Revolutionary War had been sparked by unfair taxation, the power to lay and collect taxes was the first of the specific powers Congress had used to protect the young nation. The power to tax, borrow money, issue currency, and coin money was specifically given to Congress. Congress also possesses the power to regulate commerce between the United States and other nations, as well as between the states. This includes the power to set standards for weights and measures, establish uniform bankruptcy laws, and grant copyright protection and patents. Congress has the power to create post offices and postal roads, determine the rules for becoming a citizen, and acquire, manage, and dispose of federal land. Congress has the sole power to declare war, raise armies, build ships, organize, arm, discipline, and call on state militias to act on the nation's behalf, execute laws suppressing civil unrest, and repel foreign invasions. Congress is responsible for creating all inferior courts below the Supreme Court and for determining their jurisdiction, as well as the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. The Constitution also gives Congress the power to make laws to spend money. Madison called the power of the purse the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure. Chambers' separate powers. The framers also gave the House and Senate a handful of separate powers to reinforce the bicameral system. The House has the sole power to originate all revenue bills. That is, all bills that deal with taxation must begin in the House. The framers created checks and balances between the House and Senate because the Constitution clearly invites the Senate to offer amendments to House revenue bills. The Senate has the sole authority to ratify treaties by a two-thirds vote and to confirm the president's nominees by a simple majority vote. The House requires the president to report on the state of the union and funds the bureaucracy, checks, balance, checks, thereby creating balance. Implied powers. Having vested these legislative powers in Congress, the framers needed only one more power to pull the whole list together. They needed a way to convert the powers into laws. It is one thing, after all, to tell Congress that it shall have the power to borrow money or regulate commerce, and quite another to give Congress the leverage to do so. The framers solved the problem by adding the necessary and proper clause at the very end of Section 8. Under the clause, the Constitution gives Congress the authority to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer. This clause gives Congress a set of implied powers that are never spelled out in the Constitution, but that are widely interpreted as any powers that the legislative branch needs to fulfill its duties to the nation. Given its broad grant of every authority Congress would need to make the laws, the necessary and proper clause was essential for converting the broad structure of Congress into action. Without the substance of this power, Madison wrote of the necessary and proper clause, the whole Constitution would be a dead letter. Competing chambers. Each chamber has a different age and residency requirements for future candidates. House members must be 25 years old at the time they take office and must have been citizens for at least 7 years. Senators must be 30 years old and have been citizens for 9 years. House and Senate candidates must be residents of the states from which they are elected. The framers set higher qualifications for the Senate because they wanted the chamber as a check against what they saw as the less predictable House. Concerned about the fickleness and passion of the House of Representatives, James Madison in particular saw the Senate as a necessary fence against this danger. House members and senators have different constituents or the group of citizens that they represent. House members represent districts within states, while senators represent whole states. Every state is guaranteed 2 senators, but only 1 House member. States earn additional districts by population, which is measured every 10 years by the constitutionally prescribed national census. States can win new House seats if their population increases relative to other states between each census, but they can also lose seats if their population declines or if other states increase faster. All 435 House members serve for 2 years, and they stand for re-election all at the same time. In theory, the entire House can be voted out in any given election. All 100 senators serve for 6 years, but only one-third of them stand for re-election at any given time. Until the passage of the 17th Amendment in 1913, state legislatures, not the public, selected their two senators, thereby reassuring the states that the Senate would represent their interests. These differences were clearly designed to check the passionate House with the more temperate Senate. Pressed by Thomas Jefferson to explain these differences between the House and the Senate, George Washington asked his future Secretary of State why he had just poured his tea into his saucer. To cool it, Jefferson replied. Even so, Washington explained, we pour legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it. Congressional districts. The framers hoped that the first apportionment would create just enough districts to keep the House close to the people without clogging up the lawmaking process. Constitution set initial number of citizens per district at 30,000 and required the reapportionment of districts every 10 years in such a manner as the House directed by law. Apportionment is generally defined as the outcome of the process of determining how many representatives each state will have, while reapportionment refers to the process of dividing the population into districts. However, the two terms are sometimes used interchangeably. Facing bitter conflict over the creation of new seats, the House refused to add seats to the body after the 1920 census, and thereby capped the number of members at 435. As a result, future apportionments would be based on shifting population among the states. Drawing the lines. Congress is responsible for dividing the 435 districts into a specific number for each state. But the Constitution gives the states the power to draw the House district lines for the number of seats within their borders. Every district must contain an equal number of citizens, but the geographical size of each district varies greatly between urban and rural areas. The state legislature's majority party often use redistricting to increase its hold on House elections, and thus it is a highly political process. In Miller versus Johnson, 1995, the court ruled that race could not be a predominant factor in creating electoral districts. In Rucho versus Common Cause, 2019, the court declared that gerrymandering was a political question beyond the scope of the judiciary. The decision applied to claims of partisan, not racial, gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is defined as drawing these district lines to benefit a particular political party. Incumbency advantage. Despite these differences in qualifications, constituencies, and election campaigns, House members and senators shared one very important goal: re-election. The belief that members of Congress are unsafe in any margin explains the constant effort to create safe seats. This does not mean that congressional elections are irrelevant, however. A few dozen defeats in any given election can change the House majority, and even fewer can alter the balance of power in the smaller Senate. Moreover, substantial numbers of House and Senate members retire every cycle. Senate incumbents have historically faced tougher reelection battles than their House colleagues. Incumbents start the electoral cycle having done more casework helping constituents receive better service and benefits from federal agencies. They maintain a visible presence back home through emails, tweets, letters, local meetings, and social media. Incumbents also benefit from franking privileges to send mail home without paying any postage. They stay in touch through their district or state offices, which often have more employees than the ones in their Washington office does. Incumbents use their committee and subcommittee positions to influence legislation to help their districts create jobs, build federal office buildings, repair roads and bridges, and to make loans to local businesses. Incumbents receive more free media from newspapers and television than their opponents, and they are skilled candidates, having won many campaigns during their careers. Congressmen have some influence over federal spending in their district through earmarks, which are federal expenditures for a specific project that benefits a member's district or state. Incumbents also possess a large edge in campaign funding. Public approval. Public approval of Congress continues to plummet. Approval is now at its lowest mark since the failed impeachment of Bill Clinton in 1998. Public approval roared back in 2001 when the war on terrorism was launched, but soon started to plummet as the economy began to collapse and the two congressional parties entered into the current period of gridlock. Incumbents are still winning re elections at very high rates, but continued party conflict has pulled Congress down to record levels of disapproval with no rebound in sight. As the old saying goes, the American public hates Congress, but loves its member of Congress. Organization of Congress. The building blocks of congressional organization include political parties, the committee system, the congressional staff, the caucuses, and the rules of the House and the Senate. Whether because of size, qualification, terms, calendars, debates, or passage, the bicameral system and separate powers have created a House and Senate that are both alike and different. Leadership in Congress. In the House, there is a powerful leadership system because it has so many members with short terms of office. Out of necessity, House leaders are given more power to control the actions of their members than Senate leaders are. The Speaker of the House is elected by the majority party members of Congress. Republicans call their meeting to select a leadership a conference, while the Democrats call theirs a caucus. Speaker's powers include the power to reward and punish individual members, set the legislative agenda, influence congressional campaigns, and control the flow of legislation through the House Rules Committee. The Speaker also becomes president in the event that both the president and the vice president are unable to fulfill their constitutional duties. The majority party also selects the House Majority Leader, who helps plan party strategy, confers with other party leaders, and tries to keep party members in line, while the minority party elects the minority leader. Each party also selects its own legislative whips to pressure party members to support the Speaker's position on specific votes by whipping up a majority. Senate. The Senate is smaller, less formal, and has much stronger norms, or expectations that create more cooperation between members than in the House. The majority party selects the Senate's majority leader. The majority leader has the power to persuade party members, but cannot control debate without unanimous consent of the entire Senate. They control the Senate's calendar or agenda for legislation. Unless the vice president makes a rare appearance at the helm of the chamber to cast a tie-breaking vote, Senate floor debates are actually led by a president pro tempore, usually the most senior member of the majority party. Committees. Committees do much of the work in Congress. They draft legislation, they review presidential nominees, and conduct investigations. Almost all congressional committees have subcommittees that help them do their work. Party leadership determines committee assignments. The committee system comprises standing committees, select committees, joint committees, and conference committees. In theory, every congressional committee must be created from scratch in each new Congress. In reality, however, most continue from Congress to Congress without change, although new committees are sometimes created as new issues demand attention. Standing committees. These are permanent committees in Congress with the power to propose and write legislation that covers a particular subject. They are the most important congressional arenas for policy making. Standing committees conduct hearings and launch investigations. They are organized to address different policy issues such as energy, the environment, foreign affairs, human services, and government management. Several also have administrative roles in running the House or the Senate. These committees cover 6 different legislative tasks. The Rules and Administration Committees determine the basic operations of their chamber. For example, how many staffers individual members will get, and what the ratio of majority to minority members and staff will be on the committees. Each chamber has a budget committee that sets broad targets for spending and taxes at the start of each session of Congress and pushes authorizing and appropriation committees to follow these guidelines. Authorizing committees pass the laws that tell the government what to do. They are responsible for reviewing and reauthorizing programs that are about to expire. In the Senate, authorizing committees also hold confirmation hearings for the president's nominees for senior government posts and judgeships. Appropriation committees makes decisions about how much money to spend on authorized programs. Each committee has one subcommittee for each of the 13 appropriation bills that must be enacted each year to keep the government running. Revenue committees deal with raising the money appropriating committees spend because it exists to raise revenues through taxes and also authorizes legislation that affects Social Security and oversees the Internal Revenue Service. The House Ways and Means Committee is one of the most powerful committees in Congress. Although the Appropriations Committee determines how much is spent on specific programs, the Ways and Means Committee is the only committee in either chamber that can originate tax and revenue legislation. There are 2 major oversight committees in Congress: the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee and the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. Both committees have wide latitude to investigate the performance of government. Select committees are created to highlight or investigate issues that fall outside of the jurisdiction of existing committees. They are temporary and cannot present bills to the chamber. There are four joint committees: economic, taxation, library, and printing. Committees debate and report on matters concerning Congress rather than issues of public policy. Because they consider only matters affecting Congress, such as organizing the presidential inauguration ceremonies, they do not consider legislation or report on legislation to either the House or the Senate. The framers imagined an orderly legislative process in which a bill would move from chamber to chamber until the House and Senate passed the same bill with the same bill number. But the first members of Congress soon discovered that this legislative ping pong was both inefficient and frustrating, and they invented an entirely new method for resolving differences called a conference committee. They are designed to create a compromise between the House and Senate versions of a bill, but without the endless back and forth. Committee members are appointed by the Speaker of the House and the presiding officer of the Senate, but the majority party is given more slots to fill. Created to handle just one bill and are generally given 10 to 20 days to complete their work. Committee assignments. Each political party controls a selection of committee members. The selections are generally based on a blend of between what the party needs on each committee and what its members want. The majority party selects the chair of each committee, while the minority party selects the ranking member. Most committee chairs are selected on the basis of the seniority rule. However, this rule is not absolute. Senate allows members to serve on more than one committee, but no senator is allowed to chair more than one committee. Because some committees are more prestigious than other committees, the debate over committee assignments can be intense. Members often ask for assignments that help build incumbency advantage in their home districts. Staffers, staff agencies, and caucuses. Congressional leadership and committee systems could not function without the help from congressional staff. The Senate has 4,000 personal staffers, averages 40 per state, while the House has 7,000 and averages just about 16 per district. Congressional staffers are responsible for everything from writing tweets for individual members to drafting legislation for committee and subcommittees. However, the staffs tend to be divided into those who work in Washington and those who work in the state or district offices back home. Personal staffers in Washington and the districts are almost entirely dedicated to constituency service, often in the form of casework on citizen problems, while committee and party staffers in Washington handle the larger legislative agenda. Staff agencies provide the legislative branch with resources and expertise. Some examples are the Congressional Research Service, which is the research arm of Congress. The Congressional Budget Office assesses economic implications and cost of proposed federal programs. There's also Government Accountability Office audits the finances and the administration of federal agencies and their programs. Caucuses are informal groups of senators and or House members that come together to promote shared legislative interests, such as the arts, arthritis, children, defense, immigration, tax reform, women's rights, veterans, and a whole host of industries such as corn, lumber, rice, shellfish, and steel. There are almost 300 member caucuses in Congress, many of which have Democratic and Republican members who worked together on behalf of their states. Some examples include the Steel Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues, and so forth. How a bill becomes law. Constitutional and electoral structure that checks the two chambers against each other is clearly linked to legislative action. Follow a bill, any bill, through the legislative process, and the odds are that it will die long before the next election. Barely 1 out of every 10 bills even receives a hearing, let alone time on the floor. Legislative time is precious because each sitting of Congress only lasts for 2 sessions, each lasting 1 year. If a bill is not passed by the end of the second and last session of a Congress, it must work its way through the entire legislative process again. How ideas become bills. The House and Senate have one major constitutional obligation to make the laws. But a law cannot be made until a member, committee, or a chamber as a whole has an idea for an action. Legislative ideas can come from almost anywhere: lobbying groups, family members, constituents, think tanks. Introducing a bill. House members introduce bills by simply dropping them into the hopper on the clerk's desk at the front of the House chamber. In turn, senators introduce a bill by handing it to one of the clerks who work at the front of the Senate chamber. House bills are automatically numbered in sequence with an H at the start, while Senate bills are automatically numbered in sequence also with an S followed by its number. In the more informal Senate, members sometimes short circuit these formalities by introducing a bill as an amendment to pending legislation. Referral. Once a bill has been introduced in either chamber, it is read into the daily congressional record as a formal proposal and referred by the House or Senate parliamentarian to a specific committee. The committee often refers the bill to a specific subcommittee. The House and Senate parliamentarians are career employees of Congress and are not chosen by the parties. Committee deliberation. Most bills go to committees and subcommittees and are never seen again. However, at least some are subject to committee and subcommittee hearings and eventual passage. For a bill to move forward, hearings are held, the bill is marked up, and a majority of the subcommittee must support the bill. If a subcommittee votes for a bill, its version is sent back up to the full committee for another round of hearings and review. Hearings are only held on the most important legislation. The House does allow members to force a bill to the floor if a majority signs a petition demanding action, but House discharge petitions are rarely successful. The Senate does not allow discharge petitions, but often allows its members to offer entirely new bills as amendments to pending legislation. Markup. Once a committee or subcommittee decides to pass the bill, it marks it up to modify or amend its version of the bill. The term markup refers to the pencil marks that members literally make on the final version of the bill before it is typed into the text. Each change to the bill, which can be as little as adding a punctuation mark or deleting a word, must be approved by a majority of the subcommittee or committee doing the markup. Chamber action. If the bill is moving through the House, it can only move to the floor if the powerful Rules Committee issues a formal rule. This committee sets the length of time for floor debate and whether a bill can be amended, an open rule or not, a closed rule. If it is moving through the Senate, it is automatically forwarded to the full chamber for scheduling by unanimous consent. Each bill is sent to the floor with a legislative report that summarizes the bill, makes the case for its action, and provides an estimate of the bill's cost. Debate in the House. Once a bill is reported to the full chamber, it is usually scheduled for floor action. The Speaker of the House has the power to recognize individual members who wish to speak on the floor during the debate. Virtually all the time allotted by the Rules Committee for debate on a given bill is controlled by the bill's sponsor and by its leading opponent. Debate in the Senate. The Senate tradition of unlimited debate has allowed for the use of the filibuster, a loosely defined term for action designed to prolong debate and delay or prevent a vote on a bill, resolution, amendment, or other debatable question. To understand the filibuster, it's necessary to first consider how the Senate passes a bill. When a bill is introduced, it goes to a committee, and after deliberation, if a majority of that committee votes in favor, the bill moves to the Senate floor for debate. Once a bill gets to a vote on the Senate floor, it requires a simple majority of 51 votes to pass after debate has ended. But there's a catch. Before it can get to a vote, it actually takes 60 votes to cut off debate, which is why a 60-vote supermajority is now considered the de facto minimum for passing legislation in the Senate. Prior to 1917, the Senate rules did not provide for a way to end debate and force a vote on a measure. That year, the Senate adopted a rule to allow a two-thirds majority to end a filibuster, a procedure known as cloture. In 1975, the Senate reduced the number of votes required for cloture from two-thirds of senators voting to three-fifths of all senators, or 60 of the 100-member Senate. Whether praised as the protector of political minorities from the tyranny of the majority or attacked as a tool of partisan obstruction, the right of unlimited debate in the Senate, including the filibuster, has been a key component of the Senate's unique role in the American political system. Derived from a Dutch word for freebooter and the Spanish filibusteros to describe the pirates then raiding Caribbean islands, the term began appearing in American legislative debates in the 1850s. The record for the longest individual speech goes to South Carolina's Strom Thurmond, who filibustered for 24 hours and 18 minutes against the Civil Rights Act of 1957. There are, however, exceptions to the filibuster rule. In 2013, Democrats changed the Senate rules to enable the confirmation of executive branch positions, including the cabinet and of non Supreme Court judicial nominees with a simple majority vote. 4 years later, Senate Republicans expanded the change to include Supreme Court appointments. Both changes invoked what is known as the nuclear option, or an override of a rule to overcome obstruction by the minority. At times, the Senate has also exempted certain types of legislation from the cloture rule. For example, the annual budget reconciliation process requires only a simple majority to vote and cannot be filibustered. In total, 161 exceptions to the filibuster supermajority requirement have been created between 1969 and 2014. Then there's the silent filibuster. Anytime a group of 41 or more senators simply threatens the filibuster, the Senate Majority Leader can refuse to call a vote. Unanimous consent. To consider a bill on the floor, the Senate first must agree to bring it up, typically by agreeing to a unanimous consent request or by voting to adopt a motion to proceed to the bill. Unanimous consent agreement is an agreement on the rules of debate for the proposed legislation that is approved by all the members. Only once the Senate has agreed to consider a bill may senators propose amendments to it. Although Senate amendments must technically be germane or relevant to the legislation being considered, the rule is sometimes ignored. Once recognized to speak, senators usually follow the rules embedded in the unanimous consent agreement and make the case for their amendment within the agreed time limits. However, once all unanimous consent amendments are debated, any senator is free to offer amendments, including amendments to amendments, which provides the opportunity to delay action or add unrelated issues to a popular bill that is sure to pass. Senators have almost unlimited ability to propose amendments to bills. Unanimous consent is needed to stop the introduction of amendments. Voting on the bill. After debate ends, leaders schedule a bill for a vote on the floor. Legislation rarely comes to the floor unless it's certain to pass. Under House rules, the Speaker schedules floor votes on pending legislation. The Hastert rule says that the Speaker will not schedule a floor vote on any bill that does not have a majority support within their party, even if the majority of the members of the House would vote to pass it. Majority party members. The Hastert rule is an informal rule, and the Speaker is not bound by it. They may break it at their discretion. Reconciliation. After a bill passes the House and the Senate, if the two chambers pass it with the same wording, the bill is sent to the President. If not, the bill then goes to a conference committee. If it is sent to the conference committee, the bill must be reconciled. It then must be approved by a vote of the full House and Senate, otherwise, it dies. Presidential action. Once a bill is passed in both houses in identical form, presidential action. Once a bill passes the House in identical form, it is printed and delivered to the President. The President must either approve or veto the bill. The process is not over once a bill becomes law. However, laws are sometimes repealed, amended, or even ignored. Influencing votes. Only a fraction of all bills may reach the floor, but Congress still takes hundreds of votes each year. Although most of these votes involve routine issues, members often make tough decisions that involve great national debates about war, peace, taxes and spending, and national priorities such as health care and welfare. As members come to a final position on a controversial bill, they may face pressure from both inside and outside of Congress. How colleagues matter. Members of Congress often look for advice from other members of Congress and pay particular attention to the opinions of the committee members and primary sponsors of the legislation up for a vote. Members also trade votes with their colleagues in a time honored practice called log rolling to get a bill or the log moving. Some vote trading takes place to build coalitions so that members can bring home the bacon to their constituents. Other vote trading reflects reciprocity in congressional relations or deference to colleagues' superior information or expertise. How constituents matter. Members of Congress invariably say that they vote with their constituents on major legislation, but the evidence suggests that only certain constituents actually matter to the outcome. According to one recent study of thousands of congressional votes on major policy, wealthier constituents were more likely to be represented in Congress than the average citizen. There are times when members do pay more attention to their wealthy constituents, and at times when most of their constituents do not care one way or the other about a specific vote. How ideology matters. Despite often intense pressure from both inside and outside their chambers, members of Congress are influenced by their political ideology as they confront specific issues such as gay marriage, gun control, and taxes. Generally measured on a scale from liberal to conservative, ideology is a powerful predictor of legislative votes and party cohesion. Ideology is particularly important at the margins of major policy issues such as the federal budget. Ideology also matters in the traditional standoffs between the two parties, especially when one party controls Congress and the other party controls the presidency. How interest groups matter. Interest groups influence the legislative process through a mix of high pressure tools that they have been using since the early 1800s when they waited for members of Congress in the lobby outside of the House and Senate chambers, thus earning the name lobbyist. However, today's lobbyists do much more than talk to members of Congress. They also draft legislation, organize protests, make campaign contributions, oversee legislative decisions, and build alliances with interest groups and communicate with the public through advertising and social media, including ads targeted to the constituents of particular members. Like any citizen or civic group, lobbyists have a constitutional right to use the First Amendment's right to petition government for a redress of grievances. How party matters. Democrats and Republicans have historically voted against each other on major legislative issues. However, this historical division between the two parties has become sharper over the past 2 decades in the House and Senate, in part because both parties have become more ideologically pure. Since the 107th Congress in 2001, nearly 90% of Democrats and Republicans have voted with their party on key legislative votes, compared with 80% in the 1980s and 70% during the 1970s. The standard measure of party influence is called the Party Unity Score. As the name suggests, the measure tracks the number of times that each party held together in opposition to the other. Experts often use party unity as a measure of party polarization. The more that each party votes as a bloc, the more likely they are to disagree at other stages of the legislative process. The amount of party unity voting has been increasing for decades, but is moving ever closer to the 100% party against party mark. How presidents matter. Presidents have a long list of tools for influencing members of Congress, including the ability to distribute government resources to districts and states. Presidents also help set the legislative agenda through their annual State of the Union address, the budget, and assorted legislative messages, and they lobby Congress on particularly important issues. When asked why they vote one way or the other, members of Congress tend to deny the president's influence. Presidents work hard to influence public opinion, and they have a long list of incentives to encourage congressional support, not the least of which are the invitations to special White House dinners and federal grants to support key projects back home. When Congress cannot decide, polarization. Congressional polarization leads to an inability to pass laws. In terms of ideological differences, since the mid 1970s, Republicans and Democrats have been diverging sharply. Gerrymandered districts and natural clustering of the population result in ideological homogeneous districts. This often results in rewarding members of Congress for failing to compromise. The central complaint of the Committee on Political Parties of the American Political Science Association in the 50s was that there was no clear ideological distinction between the two parties, and this in turn created confusion within the electorate. Since then, the Republican Party has adopted conservative policy positions, while the Democratic Party has generally adopted more liberal positions. This reflects a long term trend of partisan and ideological sorting that has occurred in each party and in the country. Bipartisan coalitions are now hard to forge in the absence of ideological overlap. This differentiation between the two parties has accomplished what the committee desired. Namely, it has simplified the party's ideological positions for the American public's consumption, and this in turn has elevated both the importance of the parties and their salience to the public. As the parties have become more ideologically distinct and consistent, the electorate's voting behavior has likewise become more loyal and consistent to the parties they identify with. Polarization between parties on issues is nothing new, however. What is new is that these differences have been carried over into multiple issues at once, thus exacerbating the polarized policy. Gridlock is the absence of policy change and equilibrium in spite of the existence of legislative majority that favors a change. Gridlock is hardwired into the American political process because of bicameralism and the presidential veto, and its presence requires that major legislation must have the support of a larger than minimum majority coalition from both parties. Beyond legislation, Congress is expected to oversee the activities of the executive branch. Oversight involves efforts by Congress through hearings, investigations, and other techniques to exercise control over the activities of the executive agencies. This is done in order to ensure funding is spent and laws are enforced properly. Committees or subcommittees have the oversight powers to subpoena witnesses, administer oaths, cross examine, and compel testimony. Advice and consent. The Senate must confirm executive appointments, ambassadors, and federal judges, and approve treaties. For treaties, two-thirds of senators present must consent. For appointments, a simple majority is required. Impeachment. Congress has the power to remove federal officials, including the president, through the impeachment process. The impeachment power is divided between the House and the Senate to make sure it is never abused. Under the power, the House has the authority to charge or impeach a president for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, or a federal judge for failing to serve during good behavior. But the Senate has the responsibility to conduct the trial to determine guilt or innocence. The articles of impeachment are forwarded to the Senate by a majority vote of the House, while a two-thirds vote of the Senate is required for a final conviction. No U.S. president in history has ever been convicted of an impeachable offense, but three presidents, Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump, were impeached by the House, tried by the Senate, and acquitted, and one other president, Richard Nixon, was on the precipice of impeachment and likely conviction when he resigned from office. The end.